Okay, so our previous project that we looked at was obviously this very simple example of introducing agroforestry. So this area that we looked at in this hypothetical project is actually based on a real project that we worked with when we first developed the tools, which was called the CAP SLM project. And I know that some of you might be familiar with this project. So we've taken this as an example and expanded it for use in our training. It's a hypothetical example, again in Western Kenya. It's the Kakamega forest. And the overall goals of this project were actually more complicated than just introducing the agroforestry. It had the goal for decreasing soil erosion, reducing deforestation because it was on the edge of the Kakamega forest, improving food security, and diversifying the agricultural economy. So those smallholder farmers we worked with in the previous exercise, they're real locations of real farmers. The situation was there was deforestation in the Kakamega forest, and I'm sure many of you work in this area at the moment and know that there still is some deforestation in this area. This is for a whole range of different reasons, but one of the things that the project wanted to do was to provide their smallholder farmers with another form of fuel wood, another source of fuel wood and timber, so that they were not tempted or didn't need to go into the forest to deforest. They also wanted to provide them with different income streams, so the introduction of those agroforestry plots provided them with different agricultural products that they could sell, could take to market. So this would give them better food security and better economic security. So to achieve these goals, the project was actually implemented avoided deforestation in a large area of the Kakamega forest. It also wanted to introduce reforestation, so there was an area which had been deforested in the past, and they wanted to have an active tree planting program in this area to reforest it, and then the introduction of these agroforestry plots that we've already looked at. So you can see it's a more complicated situation than we considered in our previous example. There's actually three things going on here in this one project. And this is more typical, I think, of many of the land management projects that all of you work with. So of course, avoided deforestation has greenhouse gas benefits. It protects ecosystem carbon in the above ground biomass. It protects ecosystem carbon in below ground biomass, and it protects the organic carbon in soils. Under forests, you tend to get large stocks of soil organic carbon which have built up over time. And of course, there's all the other benefits associated with avoiding deforestation, such as maintaining biodiversity, water, hydrological benefits, etc. So when forests are cleared, biomass carbon and soil carbon end up in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So there's emissions associated with deforestation. Okay, so that plot where the project is wanting to reforest, there's obviously greenhouse gas benefits associated with that. Reforestation will sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the trees as they grow. It would sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the soils as the litter builds up and is returned to the soil, as you get greater rooting volume as well in the soils. And of course you get associated benefits, which are water quality in the area is improved, you get a reduction of soil erosion, and of course sustainably managed forests can be a source of fuel, food and building materials. And then we've already looked at the agroforestry part. So of course we get the carbon sequestration in the trees and the soils when we add our agroforestry species. There are associated benefits with agroforestry, diversifying your cropping systems, your economics, improving water quality, reducing soil erosion, and sustainably managed agroforestry systems, again, are a good source of livestock, fodder, fuel, food, building materials. And in this case, fuel wood was a very important one. Okay, so this time we're going to use a mixture of both polygons and points. So we're going to set up a new project when you do the exercise, and I'll put it up so that you can see some of the details, but it's all in exercise 3, which can be downloaded from the website. We're going to upload our points file to show our smallholder farmers dotted across the landscape again. And this time we're also going to upload a GIS file, and that GIS file has 2 polygons. One large polygon over the Kakamega forest, which is an area which the project wants to protect, and it's going to be our avoided deforestation area. And then this other polygon, which covers this area of bare land here, which has been deforested in the past, and which the project plans to reforest. So we have 3 things going on. So this time our scenario analysis is a little bit more complicated, but it's the same premise. We have our initial land use, which is year 0. We have our time frame, which we're going to use 10 years because it's easy, but when you come to do your own projects, it could be whatever you like. We have what would have happened in the absence of our project under our business as usual or our baseline scenario, and then we have what's actually happening under our project scenario all over our 10 years. Okay, so in this case, our initial land use and our baseline scenario are going to be the same. So we are going to make the assumption that things as they are when we get there in year 0 will carry on as they are over the next 10 years under our baseline scenario. So we start off with forest land. We have 300 hectares of tropical mountain systems. This is natural vegetation because it's natural forest. All of our trees are greater than 20 years old, and they're actually being removed at a rate of 25 hectares per year. So that's our deforestation rate. We have 270 hectares of moderately degraded grassland. That's that polygon, if I just go back and show you. So this polygon here is actually degraded grassland. This is 270 hectares of degraded grassland. It's unimproved, so it's not being managed very well. It's just being cleared for grazing. We have our 190 hectares of cropland, which is our smallholder farmers, those points across the landscape. These are being, again, fully tilled, and we're adding 5 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen, and the residue is being collected. So the same as you did for exercise 1. So under our project scenario, what we're going to do is we're going to maintain all of our forest land area. So I should start off by saying this is actually at the end of the baseline. We're only going to end up with 300 hectares. We start off with 550 hectares of native forest, and we're going to lose 150 hectares of it under our baseline scenario. So the project scenario, we protect all of our forest area in that large polygon, and we're going to change our tree removal rate to 0 hectares per year. So we're going to assume that we stop deforestation completely. For our polygon which we want to reforest, we're going to add pine, we're going to add some native vegetation, and we're going to add some eucalyptus. So we have these 3 different mixes of different plantation species. And then we're going to add the agroforestry in exactly the same way as we did with the previous exercise. And then we're also going to add our livestock again, as we did with the previous exercise. So you can see it's a much more complicated situation. And what we're interested in is overall, with all of these activities, what will be the net impact of our project on overall greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so this is just again a summary. It might be useful to have a look at this when you're doing the exercise. 300 hectares of forest land under our baseline scenario is all that's left at the end of our 10 years because it's being cleared at a rate of 25 hectares per year. 270 hectares of grassland which is degraded, and 190 hectares of traditionally managed annual cropland. project scenario, we maintain 550 hectares of forest. We have 270 hectares going from grassland into different plantations, pine plantation, which is other species, and eucalyptus. And then we're introducing our agroforestry area, as we did with the previous exercise. So of course, again, we're adding in our dairy cattle, and as we saw before, we have methane emissions from dairy cattle. We had an interesting question by email before this session, which was whether you can change the methane emissions from cattle to account for changes in feedstock and changes in fodder. And we're actually going to go on and have a look at the detailed assessment, and I can show you how that can be done in the detailed assessment. So again, from the livestock, we have these emissions from manure, methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, and of course, your manure can be added to the soil as a soil amendment, in which case it's going to increase your organic matter. Okay, so that's really just an overview. We're not going to do the exercise right away, because for this particular exercise, we're going to go on and use the detailed assessment, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. But are there any questions before we go on to look at the detailed assessment, just about this idea of looking at projects which have multiple things going on in multiple areas?
Thank you so much. I think for me,
Okay, so we've already had a go at using the simple assessment. Now we're going to look at the second tool of the Carbon Benefits Project toolset, which is the detailed assessment. Apologies about the title here, where it's obviously not Friday the 5th of July. Okay, so Catherine, I'll come back to your question after this presentation. Thanks a lot for your patience, and apologies that I couldn't hear you. So the detailed assessment is really a way of using more accurate data to reduce the uncertainty in the estimation that you make. So in the exercise that we did, we set up a project, we went through this project information module, you chose your tool from the Toolkit Advisor, you described spatially where it was you're working, we skipped through this guidance module, and we went and we used the simple assessment. So now we're just going to use the detailed assessment instead. Okay, so the goal for this session is to introduce users to the detailed assessment tool, to explain when the detailed assessment tool should be utilised. So the simple assessment, as we've seen, relies to some degree on generalisations and assumptions to allow a more rapid assessment of carbon and greenhouse gas balance. So you will have noticed as you went through, you were using these drop-down menus, and you chose from a pre-populated list of different cropping systems and grassland systems, etc. So it uses generalised forest types, common tree species. So those lists that you pulled up will have been specific to Kenya, the most common cropping systems, most common forest types that are found in that part of Africa. So the detailed assessment, as the name suggests, allows users to provide more specific information on cropping practices, woody species, and most importantly on these emission factors. So again, your emission factor is a factor which changes any kind of activity into a greenhouse gas emission or a stock change. And these are to do with crop management, rice management, we have new and different woody species, but the user can also still use all of the standard default IPCC equation factors, or you can provide your own. So you could actually use the detailed assessment and you could just describe things in more detail, but still use all of the default emission factors. Or you could use the detailed assessment, and it could be that you just have one emission factor that you want to change, but you still want to use a detailed assessment. Okay, we come back to our basic equation, which is behind everything that we do, which is that our emissions rates, our emissions of greenhouse gases, or our changes in carbon stocks, are your activity, which is what is being done and where it's being done, times your emission factor. So just a reminder, your activity data could be something like area being planted to trees, amount of fertilizer being applied, number of dairy cattle. And then your emission factor is a factor which changes this into a stock change or a greenhouse gas emission. So something like a growth rate for a certain type of tree, the amount of N2O emitted by a certain type of fertilizer, the amount of methane emitted by a certain type of cattle. Okay, so these emission factors, if you are going to choose your own, and what's already happened with the IPCC method, is that activities have been stratified. So activities are stratified or subdivided according to factors that most affect greenhouse gas emissions rates and carbon sequestration rates. Some examples of these stock change factors that affect something like soil carbon could be a type of vegetation. So if I had a cropland area and I wanted to work out different stock change factors for that area, it would be things like the type of vegetation, is it grass versus a crop, its relative productivity, is it fertilised versus non-fertilised, plant residues, are these being removed, tillage type, etc. All of these are factors which are going to change the amount of carbon that is lost or stored in the soil. And this is just an example of factors again determining soil carbon change, so things like vegetation type, productivity, residue management, manure additions. These are all inputs to the system which will then impact on how much carbon is stored in the soil. And then things that determine the rate at which decomposition happens and this carbon is lost back to the atmosphere as CO2 could be things like soil type, drainage, tillage amount. So activities are stratified or subdivided according to factors that most affect greenhouse gas emissions. The factors used to stratify activities, e.g. subdivide land area, are reflected in the value of these emission factors. So this will become clearer, I think, as we go through. When we come to do the exercise, we will look at creating a detailed report. And the detailed report is an Excel spreadsheet that actually then gives you the equations that are being used in all of the calculations. When you look at these equations, they have different factors within them, which are your emission factors. And these factors will vary depending on where in the world you are, the climate that you're working on, etc. So here's just an example of some of the stock change factors used for soil carbon. You can see there's a factor for different climate and tillage types. If we take tillage, for example, you can see that for conventional tillage in a temperate dry area, we have a factor of 1. For reduced tillage, we have 1.02. This is different in a moist area, it's different in a dry area, tropical dry area, and different in a tropical moist area. So you can see how there's an interaction between the different factors being used and the types of tillage, for example. So for your simple assessment, your emission of stock change factors are all default values. They're already supplied by the tool and you can't change them. And therefore the stratification requirements for activity data has already been done for you. All of your stock change and emission factors are already there. They've all been categorized according to different climate regions, according to different soil types, etc. So all we need to use the simple assessment is your activity data. So for the detailed assessment, we can actually make things very more project specific, and we begin to change our emission and stock change factors. So these can be changed to be project or region specific values. For those of you who know about the IPCC method, you'll know that some of the factors used in the IPCC method are very broad brush. You can have one factor for the whole of Africa, for example. So just by looking up a region-specific factor, you can already reduce the uncertainty that's involved in your calculations. So it says here, project or region-specific values need to be measured, but I would say, or they need to have been measured in the past. It's not always the case that you need to go into the field to take new measurements. It could be that you already have a soil organic carbon factor under a native forest type, which someone has from a PhD thesis that's been published or from a paper that's been published. And you can always use that. You don't always have to have a measurement campaign. So your activity data needs to be stratified differently to coincide with the project-specific emission or stock change factors. It just means that if you have an area where, for example, you have two different climate types, you need to collect your activity data for those two different climate types. Okay, so this is just the home page of the detailed assessment. You can see that it looks very much like the simple assessment. We go through the same process, exactly the same with the project description, setting up your areas, your land use areas, and your polygons and points. This time, we go through the same process of describing land management for initial land use, baseline scenario, and project scenario. But there's an extra step for each different land use category when we start talking about land management, and that is emission factors. So each of these land use categories will have its own emission factor page. Okay, so I'll just walk you through some of the pages in the detailed assessment. You can see how they're slightly different from the simple assessment. The biggest difference is on the annual croplands page. So on the annual croplands page, rather than choosing a cropping system from a drop-down list, the user actually types in your own cropping system, and this time you build up a crop rotation. So rather than just saying I have a maize wheat system, I can say that in year one I'm growing maize, and this is followed by legumes and pulses, and then in year two I'm growing Napier grass. So I've already got a 2-year rotation. And then rather than just describing the management of the whole cropping system, so you remember in the simple assessment, we said 5 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer was being added to the whole cropping system. Now we can say specifically where that nitrogen is being added. So we can see it's actually been added in year one to our first crop, which is maize. So you can see you can make things a lot more specific. You can begin to build up these rotations, and you can describe the management of each of your individual crops. You can have up to 3 crops in a year, which I think most systems only have 2. It's unusual to have 3, but you can have 3. And you can have as many years in your rotation as you want to. When you choose your crops, there's a list of default crops for you to choose from. Again, these will be the most common crops for the area that you've chosen. So if you've chosen Kenya, it will be the most common crops available in Kenya. You also then have the option to add a new crop. So if you look through this list and you say, well, my crop isn't on here, that's because it wasn't part of this IPCC assessment where they looked at all the different types of crops that could be present in different places. So you would click on Add a New Crop. You would give your crop a name. So for example, we did quite a lot of work in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, a very common crop is called teff, which is a grain crop. It's quite similar to wheat, but it's a small grain crop. So you would call it whatever you like. So we called it teff. You then need to say if it's a grass, if it's wetland rice, if it's nitrogen fixing, or if it's low residue, or if it's fallow. So check these boxes, then click on Create, and then your crop is in your list for you to use in the future. What's going to happen is then when you go to your emissions factor page, you can really start to change some of the factors associated with this crop, which is where you make everything very more specific. Okay, we'll look at the Forestland pages. Looks very much the same as the simple assessment. Again, everybody starts off with this box 1 where you choose your project activity areas that you're working with. Add it to the table below. Again, as the same with the simple assessment, keep hitting these save buttons as you go through. This time you can add a tree type, and again you can create your own tree type or forest type, and you're actually going to do this in exercise 3, which we'll have a go at in the rest of this session. And again, you then go to your emissions factor page, which is where you change some of the stock change and emission factors associated with the forest type that you create. Tree age ranges, your natural losses. So we have here, this is just an example of our list of different forest types. The natural losses and wood removal page is the same as the simple assessment. Again, removals from timber harvesting, fuel wood gathering, reforestation rate, deforestation rate, with and without burning. Grassland pages, again this is the same, but you can add your own grassland system if you want to. And we have silver pasture pages. Again, we have some of these drop down options for grassland type. And the same woody biomass pages associated with silver pasture. So it looks very much the same as the simple assessment. The main difference is this emissions factor page. Settlements, again, the only thing we can describe in a settlement, a town or a village, is the number of trees that are being added or taken away. Again, we can choose a forest type, and you can add your own tree forest type for settlements if you want to, and again change the emission factors. So you can see you just have this flexibility to add things into the system which aren't there as part of a default. Your livestock, again, it looks more or less the same as a simple assessment. This time, again, you say how many livestock you have of different categories, how many months per year they spend in the activity data, how the manure is managed. This time, for emission factors for livestock, you can't create your own livestock category, but what you can do is you can change the emission factors associated with each of these different livestock categories. So if you chose dairy cattle, you could then change the methane emissions associated with dairy cattle, and it will only change for your project. It won't change for every other project that you work on. Manure management, okay. So here we just pull up one of these emission factor pages. So I'm in Forestland. I've described forest types. I've added my own natural losses and woodland removal, and we've gone to the emission factors page. I should say, if you don't want to change your emission factors, you can just ignore this page. You don't need to go through it. What we have here is a list of all of the different factors which are being used in the calculations associated with Forestland. So things like above ground biomass stock, which is tons of dry matter per hectare, etc. It lists them here. Ones that are in green are actually good candidates for you to change or improve. You could change them through a measurement and monitoring program, and they can be edited. The ones that are in black, you can change them. It's probably going to be a bit more complicated, time consuming, maybe a bit more expensive, but they can be changed. The ones which are shown in red are either very difficult and expensive for you to measure, or they could also be constants, which are just constants in the system, or they might be small, and they might make a very small difference to actual greenhouse gas estimation. So we don't recommend that you change the ones in red, but you can if you want to. So if we just go back, say I was to choose, for example, above ground biomass stock here, if I highlighted it in the table, in the second box, It would pull this up for me. It would tell me the land use climate region that I'm in, the tree type, the age, and the factor that's being used. So this would be 13 tonnes of dry matter per hectare. And it says it's a field measurement, and it gives me the uncertainty that's associated with it. I have actually created my own forest type here and called it Yala Watershed. It will give me a default value, which is based on all of the forest types that are in this particular region. I can simply double click on this and I can replace it with my own value. So if I know of a different above ground biomass accumulation rate, which I've taken from a paper, a PhD study, or a measurement campaign, I can go ahead and I can replace it. If I did that, we would then write a note in this box here, which I would say changed by Eleanor Milne, data taken from wherever I got it from, and then a date. And we encourage you to do this and to put as much detail as possible in here. And this is so that when you come back after you've done your greenhouse gas assessment, you can see exactly where you've got these changed factors from. If I wanted to change this factor, but I don't actually have any data at the moment, I'm thinking of doing a measurement campaign of going into the field. This third box here, it points me to different protocols for measuring and monitoring. So it'll point me to a protocol for going and measuring above ground biomass accumulation. I can click on one of these and it will pull up a relevant chapter of a monitoring protocol. We have some protocols which were developed specifically for the CBP project, but we also have others. So for example, there's a book by Ravindranath and Oswald, and they very kindly allowed us to reproduce some of their chapters, so you can link to some of their chapters which tell you how to measure these things. It also links you to the IPCC tables where this original value came from. Okay, so as I say, it links to a number of different sources for measurement and monitoring methods. Some of them were produced by colleagues from ICRAF, for example, as we went through and developed the tools. And this is just some examples of some of the protocols that we have. Again, some specifically developed by ICRAF for the CBP tools, others which are available from other sources. Okay, so that's a real whistle-stop tour of the detailed assessment. I think what it might be useful for me to do is to produce a detailed report from the previous exercise that we did, and then I can show you the calculations that are being used in the system and where these stock change and emission factors actually come in. So I'm going back to this agroforestry exercise that we did. I'm going to create a detailed report and we can have a look at what's created. Okay. Yeah, Rachel, please go ahead and answer the question.
Thanks, Eleanor.
Hi, Eleanor. Sharif again here. I have a question about the soil carbon capture equation that you had in your presentation. I think the coefficients in the subscripts were not so clear to me, and I was just kind of interested in what they were actually standing for.
Okay. That leads on very nicely to what I'm just about to show you. Okay.
Fantastic.
So this is the detailed report that I've just produced. And what the detailed report actually has is a tab for every single sink and source of greenhouse gas emissions that's involved in your net greenhouse gas balance. If you click on any one of these, it's going to pull up the equation that's being used and all of the different parts of that equation, and then how your area is being stratified, project activity area, climate area, category, etc. If we go to the mineral soil carbon one, to answer your question, here's the equation that's being used. So soil organic carbon is the area times your soil organic carbon reference factor times your management factors. So when you were in the system and you were saying things like it's conservation tillage, or it's no tillage, or it's full tillage, that's what these management factors are. Okay, and you can see, here's the equation, and here are all the parts of the equation listed underneath. And it also gives you the units that's being used. So finally, the thing, it gets converted into carbon rather than CO2.
What is the uncertainty in flu? What does that mean?
Which one's that? This one here?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so flu is, again, it's a management factor. And so this, every single factor that's being used will have an uncertainty associated with it. So FLU, I think, is a management factor associated with the type of land use. So if we look here, our land use category is agroforestry. So for agroforestry, for land under agroforestry, okay.
So FLU basically stands for factor of land use.
Yes, it's a land use factor. And the uncertainty will then have been calculated when the IPCC put together a huge literature review and determined what this factor should be. They will have calculated a certain estimate of uncertainty, which is error in the measurements that are taken, error involved in upscaling this to a large area. So we're working in Africa here, so it's probably a management factor that results that applies to Africa. So it's like an error propagation method that's used to come up with an uncertainty estimate, if that makes sense.